Welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Melissa Muller, and the Rose Institute is excited to welcome Mr. Speaker Pérez to our lunch today. Speaker Pérez is the current Vice Chair of the University of California Board of Regents. Previously, he was elected to the California Assembly in November 2008, representing downtown Los Angeles and certain communities of East Los Angeles. In January 2010, his colleagues elected him as California's 68th Assembly Speaker. He was subsequently re-elected in 2010 and 2012, making him one of the longest-serving speakers in the era of term limits. Prior to his service in the Assembly, Pérez was a lifetime member of the labor movement, and today he will be discussing the California comeback. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Speaker Pérez.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I thought that we'd just do a little bit of background, both about myself and about the experience that California has been through over the last 10 years, the impacts of the Great Recession, and California's response to the Great Recession, and what it means for what we can expect in economic growth and response to normal economic cycles in the future. Perhaps we'll get a little into some comparison between the California experience and the national experience. So, and then we'll spend the balance of the time discussing whatever folks in the room want to discuss. I grew up in California, and it was a California that looked very much like the California of today, except for with respect to the question of who the elected officials were in the state of California and how we approached questions of diversity and representation. There's been a good deal of discussion in the last couple of years about court cases that have changed the standards with respect to questions of voting rights throughout the country that we'll see play out significantly in the next round of redistricting after the next census. And too often when people think of the question of voting rights, they think of this as a north-south question, and they think of it as a black-white question. And the reality is that the challenges of voting rights issues are much broader than that, and in fact, California is a state that has had some very troubled history with respect to voting rights. And up until and including the last set of redistricting, California was held to both sets of standards under the previous systems of voting rights evaluation, and it guided the sequence and the process by which the state had to approach voting rights questions because of a historic pattern of gerrymandering which disenfranchised a variety of communities, not the least of which a community that is now the plurality in California, and that is the Latino community. You still see some of these issues playing out in local city elections throughout the state of California, in particular several cities in Southern California that still are struggling with a balance in terms of their approach, whether they have citywide elections or district-based or ward-based elections, and what those decisions mean with respect to interpretations of voting rights and patterns of electoral decisions. So I grew up in a California that never would have anticipated me becoming Speaker of the legislature. I grew up in this state at a time when there had only been a handful of Latinos in state office, and where there had never been an openly gay person elected to state office in California. So as a young Latino gay man growing up in Los Angeles, the idea of being in office was unheard of, and the idea of actually leading the legislature was unimaginable. Much of that changed over a series of challenges, both legal and political, in changing redistricting in California. And ultimately, while I am not a fan of term limits, the passage of a constitutional amendment adopting term limits in California expedited some of the changes in representation in the state and demographic representation in particular. I say that by way of background so that you can understand how, when I was elected Speaker, nobody was more shocked than I was. So I ran for office in 2008, an unusual year when California had two primaries. A February primary to vote on who we would support as presidential nominee in both parties, and where a variety of ballot measures were also on the ballot. The most significant of which for my own election was a ballot measure which would have extended term limits for current members of the legislature. My representative at the time had been the speaker, was the sitting speaker of the Assembly. He and the sitting pro tem of the Senate were about to be termed out and didn't like the idea of being termed out, so they got their friends to qualify a ballot measure to extend their time in office, and took advantage of the early primary to have a regular primary in June, so that if the voters supported term limit extensions in February, they could run for re-election in June. Voters didn't like that idea. The election significantly revolved around the idea of self-dealing and the self-interest of the two legislative leaders. So term limits were left intact, as had previously been passed. And now in February, there's nobody running to replace the speaker. So I was dumb enough to think I could do it. I announced for the office and found myself running against the speaker's district director and the senator's district director, and was third or fourth in most people's consideration in a very short run. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I out-organized them. And I beat everybody handily and got most of the candidates to drop out after the close of filing, but before Election Day, and assumed office in November, or was elected in November, and sworn in December 1st of that year. What's the significance? Historically in California, legislators get elected in November, get sworn in the first Monday of December, and then they go home and celebrate the holidays, come back in mid-January, slowly decide to hire a staff and decide what legislative approaches they would take, and maybe around February or March they start working in earnest. Well, the full impact of the Great Recession was coming straight at us. And so we were sworn in December 1st of that year. We were allowed to go back home, and within 10 days, we were all called back as we discovered the state of California had a $60 billion deficit out of a $120 billion budget. So we were in real serious trouble. In fact, in the next year, there were 3 specific times where California almost was forced into bankruptcy, something that was unimaginable. But in fact, during that same period of time, you saw municipalities like Detroit, and in California, Stockton and San Bernardino go bankrupt. And California was facing that very clear possibility. And so in December, January, and February, we passed our first budget 4 months before the constitutional deadline. It required us to have a variety of overnight sessions where we were in session for 36, 42, and I think 28 hours in each of those sessions, working through the details of a budget. But structurally, the challenge for California was particularly strong because we weren't only dealing with a massive budgetary deficit, we were dealing with challenges of governance as well. California was one of only 3 states in the country that required a supermajority to pass a budget. The other 2 were Rhode Island and Arkansas. And I don't know about you, but I don't think California is very much like Rhode Island or Arkansas. Not in our significance, not in our size, not in the complications of governance. The other distinction is Arkansas and Rhode Island had single-party rule that exceeded their supermajority threshold. So California was in fact the only state in the country that required a bipartisan supermajority. You only have to look at what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now to understand how complicated finding bipartisan compromise in tough economic choices can be. So it was a very serious and very difficult set of budgetary negotiations. We ultimately passed a budget that the majority party, my party, hated. But the choices were between making budgetary decisions that you didn't like or having the state go into bankruptcy. and resulting in circumstances that were worse than the budgetary decisions you had to make. And so it required people of both parties to make decisions that they didn't like in the interest of saving the state of California. When that budget was passed, it required a handful of Republican votes and every Democratic vote in both houses. And everybody who was involved in that budget paid a price. In particular, the Republicans who voted for that budget paid the price. And the reason was one of the elements of the budget was authorizing a question on the ballot to do short-term tax approvals to fill part of the hole. And so you had a handful of Republicans spread across the two houses that in their effort to save the state took a vote they hated to authorize a tax increase. You had Democrats taking votes they hated to make cuts in programs they held dear. Each of those Republicans who took the vote to save the state at that moment ultimately lost their next election. And they paid the ultimate political price for standing up for saving the state of California. There was one other thing that was put on the ballot that year as part of the budget package, and that was eliminating the traditional party primaries in California and going to the top two system that we now have. It was a request by then Governor Schwarzenegger that he had offered up by a guy named Abel Maldonado, who was in the Senate at the time. It was a prerequisite for the governor signing the budget. It was clearly not a fiscal consideration. And it really highlights that when California had a supermajority requirement to pass a budget, a few people could extract major changes in policy that had nothing to do with economic policy as condition for the passage of a budget. That idea around the top two primary was anathema to the overwhelming majority of members of both parties. Both parties. And the decision was made that both parties had to bite the bullet in order to save the state. And so both parties in both houses put up 2/3 of their members to approve the ratification of that question going on the ballot. So there were two sets of Republicans that really took bold decisions in that budget. The four that voted to pass the budget and the 2/3 that voted to ratify the budget, putting a question on the ballot they hated. And on the Democratic side, it was the same thing. You had every member who voted to pass the budget and 2/3 who voted to ratify a ballot measure being put on the ballot that they hated. You don't get to make the decisions that you want to make when you're serious about governing. You get to make the best decisions that you think are possible given the circumstances and the challenges of the time. Appropriately, the John F. Kennedy Library recognized the legislative leaders of both houses and both parties that year with the Profiles in Courage Award for saving the state of California by taking these decisions that were really politically very dangerous, but were essential to saving the state of California. Within a couple of months, we found that the solution wasn't strong enough. The voters rejected the short-term tax increase, and the budget started crumbling away. And so we had to go back and reopen the budget and make additional cuts. And those were difficult decisions as well. We made the cuts, and this is now March of 2009. Governor Schwarzenegger did something unprecedented. Not only did he sign into law these cuts, but he took it as an opportunity to retroactively make unilateral cuts in previous budgetary actions, something that was unprecedented. The governor of California, like most governors, has something that's often referred to as a blue pencil. It's a line item veto in budgets. But what Schwarzenegger did was not line item veto the budget bill in front of him, but use the opening of this new budget bill to retroactively veto things that he had previously signed into law, something that exceeded, in my opinion, his constitutional authority. Much like running for office was a fool's errand on my part that worked out okay. I went to the leaders of both houses I had now been in office for all of 3 months, so I knew all the answers, because I had all of 3 months' experience. And I said, this governor is exceeding his constitutional authority. You must sue him and challenge this constitutional overreach. They laughed me out of the Capitol. And so I went to the speaker at the time and asked her if she would have a problem if I sued the governor. She said, it's your money, go ahead. And so, while everybody else went on spring break, I hired lawyers and sued the governor and challenged him in court for a constitutional overreach. And as I was doing press on this, I get a call from the head of the Senate saying, now that it's getting some traction, you know, you're right, we should be in charge of this lawsuit, not you. And the Senate leader and the speaker asked me if I would relinquish control of the lawsuit to them. I did. The Senate President Pro Tem changed the underlying theory of the lawsuit and lost in court. And as a result, we now have case law that supports a governor retroactively making cuts, which I think is actually a very dangerous precedent. I believe, although there's no way of ever knowing, that if we had kept the original legal theory, that the governor would have been overruled. I guess that was interesting to my colleagues, because the speaker was about to be termed out of office and was running for Congress, Karen Bass, who now serves in Congress in Los Angeles. And there was a competitive election for speaker, and there were multiple people who had run against Karen and were running again for speaker, and they were not having much success in getting their majorities. And so I was recruited by some folks to run, and I thought it was a crazy idea to run as a freshman. And they kept beating up on me until I finally agreed to run for speaker. And on my one-year anniversary in the legislature, I was elected speaker of the assembly and served in that role for the next couple of years, next 4.5 years. That next year, we had a $36 billion deficit and still a supermajority requirement to pass a budget. So we went out and qualified a ballot measure, not by legislative action, but by signature, to return California to simple majority budgetary decision-making. But there was no expectation that the voters would agree to simple majority, because on the basis, supermajority sounds better than simple majority because it sounds like you're working to get a consensus, right? If we require 2/3 majority, that means we're seriously working towards a consensus. Doesn't that get us better results than something that you pass by a simple majority? So we had to figure out how to convince voters to get from this notion that supermajority was better than simple majority. And one of the things we did was say, and if the legislature fails to pass a budget on time, because California historically passed late budgets, very late budgets, which created all kinds of distress for public employees, for people that contract with the state, for businesses looking at predictability in the state. So if they fail to pass an on-time budget with a simple majority, legislators lose their pay until they pass a budget. And so that punitive idea of punishing legislators for passing a late budget carried the day. And so in 2010, the voters approved a constitutional amendment to get to a simple majority. But as we're building towards that election, we're dealing with a $36 billion deficit, supermajority requirement, and I'm now a brand new speaker dealing with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Republican leaders in both houses that have all the leverage. Democrats had 60+% of the seats in the legislature, but the budget was negotiated by 5 people, affectionately referred to as the Big Five: the governor, the speaker, the Senate President Pro Tem, and the minority leaders of both houses. So we had 60% of the seats, but we were only 2 of the 5 around the table. That math didn't seem to work out. And the governor wanted to make massive cuts to a variety of programs to balance the budget, and quite frankly, you needed to make massive cuts to balance the budget, but it was a question of where and what the values were as you evaluated where to make those cuts. A traditional approach would have been a very defensive posture for Democrats trying to defend social programs and a variety of other things that, while they may be important, are not resonant with voters. And so I looked at my experience in the labor movement and said, when management offers a contract I don't like, I don't just complain, I've got to come up with a counter proposal. So for the first time ever, we had the legislature do a complete restructuring of the budget and have a full counter proposal, something that I had structured both on two questions. One, whether or not budgetary decisions get you to a balanced budget, and two, what the jobs impact of any budgetary decision were, whether it would result in a decrease in jobs or an increase of jobs, or whether it was expected to be neutral. And we called this the California Jobs Budget. And it completely reframed the debate. And it set up for what is now an annual practice of the Assembly offering their construct of a budget before a governor ever can. We went and fought on those budgetary terms for a long time. In fact, in the end, we passed a budget that year 104 days past the constitutional deadline, the latest budget in the history of the state of California. The evaluation that we had made was that the governor's budget proposal would have reduced 430,000 jobs in California at a time where we had the highest rate of unemployment in our recorded history and the second highest rate of unemployment anywhere in the country. And so this notion of evaluating the budget on impact of jobs became a resonant issue. And while it took us a very long time, 104 days past the constitutional deadline, we were able to pass a balanced budget that also protected 400,000 of those 430,000 jobs. We took that as a significant victory. That year, Schwarzenegger was termed out of office. Jerry Brown was elected in. The state was now dealing with a new budget, $26 billion in deficit day one, and a variety of other very difficult decisions. In fact, the legislature passed a budget on time. The governor was trying to leverage again for a short-term tax increase. Republicans would not vote for it. We couldn't get to agreement with the governor on what he would do for the budget. We passed a budget that was balanced, but didn't have the tax increases. The governor vetoed the budget, and the legislature lost its pay for the next couple of weeks until we renegotiated a new budget. It was a good trade-off to lose our pay for a couple of weeks in exchange for the pressure of getting a new budget passed. We passed the budget within 2 weeks, so while we were technically 2 weeks late in passing the budget, it was still passed before the constitutional deadline for the enactment of the budget. And it set a new pattern for on-time budgeting, because it's truly considered on time when it's enacted as opposed to passed. And for the last 8 years, California has had the first ever string of 8 years of on-time balanced budgets. In the next year, when we passed a balanced budget, without a veto of the governor this time, what we saw is significant improvement to the credit worthiness of the state of California. In that year alone, we achieved $980 million in savings in finance costs for the state because of the improvement of our credit rating. And we redirected 1/3 of that money to public higher education. And the next year as we came back, we used a portion of that savings to not only invest in public higher education, but expand access for financial aid in private nonprofit higher education, so that we were investing in every successful segment of higher education in California. And at the same time, we did something that the federal government attempted to do in the last 2 years, which is disinvest any public assistance to private for-profit institutions that had high default rates, low graduation rates, and low job placement rates. Folks who were really building their economic model off of public assistance, public investment, without returning good results for students in either graduation or in job placement. It's a model that was attempted in multiple states after that, and with limited success. As we looked at the recovery of the state, there were a couple of other things that we needed to do. We needed to invest in areas like green manufacturing. where California had an advantage over other states. And we passed a green manufacturing tax that brought thousands of jobs online relatively quickly. And what we saw from 2011 through 2014 was that California continued to grow jobs and expand its economy, grow jobs at a faster rate than any other state, expand its economy at a faster rate than most other states. Oregon and Washington were still outpacing us, but not by much. But it was a result of these efforts of really focused fiscal discipline. I looked at the pattern historically of cyclical funding in the state of California and the fact that we had good years and lean years, and that in good years we tended to spend a little more than we should, and in lean years we had to cut. And then when you got back to other good years, you spent a little more, and then you felt guilty, so you cut a tax a little bit. But then in the next set of lean years, you can cut the spending, but you couldn't close the tax loophole that you created, which resulted in year-over-year ratcheting of investment in public goods. And so I proposed something that was ultimately passed as Prop 2, which was the California Rainy Day Fund, where in simple terms, when you had unpredictable increases in revenues, when you had spiking revenues, you needed to take those and sweep them into a rainy day fund. For the first 10 years, you could use half of it to pay down long-term debt and invest in infrastructure. After that, you had to put all of it in a savings account to use in bad economic times, because guess what? There are always bad economic times somewhere in the future. 20-year retrospective would show that if we had done this 20 years before, the money in a rainy day fund would have eliminated the budgetary impacts of normal recessions and cut in half the budgetary impact of the Great Recession. This year in the governor's proposal, his budget proposal, the rainy day fund will be fully funded, and California will be in the strongest economic position that it's ever been in anticipation of a normal cycle economic downturn. Hopefully it takes some time to get to that normal cycle economic downturn, but when we get there, and we will get to one, they do happen cyclically, California will be in the best shape that it's been in preparing for one. As we made these investments as well, we looked at going back and reinvesting in areas that took disproportionate cuts in the Great Recession: education, K-14 in particular. As I said, some targeted investment in higher education, access to health care. I authored the Covered California plan, the first health benefit plan in the country. So when you look at the Obamacare model, California's success is significantly higher than other states because we have a well-crafted state-specific plan. I authored the expansion of Medicaid 2 years after that, so we have more potentially coverable people covered in California than any other state. Those two pieces of legislation alone account for 3 million people with health insurance in California that wouldn't have had health insurance otherwise. And then the last area of focus that I want to mention is during that same period of time, we know that when there was disinvestment in education, there was also a significant increase in student debt. And we were approaching the period of time where student debt would outpace credit card debt at $1 trillion. Now it's even larger than that. So I authored and we passed, it took 2 years and slight modifications, the middle class scholarship, which reduced in practical terms fees for 80% of students at UC and CSU by 40%, so that you chipped away at the debt burden of middle class and upper middle class families. I think that those models that we saw play out in California, starting with the political risks taken by people in both parties to pass the budgets of 2009 that prevented us from going into bankruptcy, stand in stark contrast to what you see at the national level with respect to the framing of what the responsibility of elected officials is in dealing with tough budgetary and fiscal circumstances. You'll see that if you look seriously at Tig trying to answer a call from our office. You'll see that if you look seriously at not only the potential implications of the tax plan on out-year debt. But when you look at the implications of the president's budget proposals that in combination will create unprecedented levels of debt, I don't think that they'll ultimately be the budgetary decisions that Congress passes, but the fact that they're even what is being proposed right now really shows us a sharp sea change in Washington, D.C. in its approach to long-term deficits and debt. So with that, why don't I just open the conversation to wherever folks want to go.
Hello, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for your talk. Appreciate it. I especially appreciate this part at the beginning. I felt like you're being modest when you're talking about kind of your origins and your leap into the legislature. I imagine as an kind of organized labor leader in Los Angeles, you would have had a hand in kind of picking candidates for a lot of years and supporting candidates that end up being in the state legislature. What was the impetus for you to move from being someone behind the scenes, kind of picking people to go there and thinking, did it get so bad that you saw yourself you needed to be in the room in Sacramento to fix it, or what drove you to go there?
So look, I would be lying if I didn't say I always had the desire to be there. But it wasn't until about 2008 that I thought it was possible. And so I started working on campaigns when I was 14 years old. Started making money on campaigns when I was 16 years old. So by the time I ran for office at 38 years old, I had a decent amount of campaign experience behind me. And you're right, as a labor leader, I helped a lot of people get elected. Ultimately, that was particularly impactful in people wanting to support me as Speaker, because even though I'd only been in office for a series of months, there were deep relationships over a series of years in helping people in elections. In 1994, California, for the first time ever, elected an openly gay member of the legislature. That was Sheila Kuehl, who now serves on the LA County Board of Supervisors, who ran for the Assembly in 1994 as the first, as I said, openly gay or lesbian person in the state of California. Sheila literally was walking precincts in Santa Monica in a very progressive district, and somebody said, you know, I'm going to vote for you because you've already told me the worst thing you could possibly tell me about yourself. And she said, what's that? And they said, the fact that you're a lesbian. If you're willing to be honest with me about that, I assume you won't lie to me about anything else. So it was a positive reaction to her for still a very negative expectation of what it meant for her to be running as an openly lesbian candidate. The next year, there was a special election that elected the second openly lesbian person, and that was Carol Migden. And about 4 years later, you elected the first gay men. When I ran in 2008, there had never been a gay man elected in the southern half of the state, and there had never been an openly gay person of color elected anywhere in the state of California. So the delay in running was not out of an evaluation of other people. It was out of an evaluation of when it would be possible to actually succeed. And so I never really expected that it would be possible, but the unique nature of 2008 with the two primaries gave me a different sense of possibility. And the fact that I thought I could out-organize these other folks, and thankfully for me, I was successful at out-organizing them. But it was really that change of what was viewed as possible. You'll have to understand that it was a particularly odd year in that in June of 2008, the state Supreme Court invalidated Proposition 22, which was the first ban on gay marriage in California. And so for a brief period between June and November, same-sex marriage was legal in California. Prop 8 was on the ballot to again invalidate same-sex marriage. My district voted by 52% to pass Prop 8 and invalidate same-sex marriage. I was elected by 85%. So they overwhelmingly voted to send me to Sacramento and told me, by the way, don't get married while you're up there.
Thank you so much for your speech. I specifically liked the part where you talked about having to make hard decisions when there are extraordinary circumstances. So I was hoping you could draw on your experience with the labor movement and comment on the pension obligation crisis. Is that something that the state is going to kind of let cripple us, or do we keep raising revenues? Or is it possible to go back to someone and say, actually, that promise we made to you is not what it seemed?
I think that is a perfect question for us to evaluate right now. And there are a couple of different pieces to it, if you'd allow me to parse it a little bit. I think leaders have an absolute obligation to get us out of the pension hole that we're in, but the tools are more limited than people would like them to be. Case law suggests that you cannot change accrual of pension for current employees in public sector, which is different than the reality in private sector. In private sector employment, you can't retroactively change, but you can prospectively change. And so, for example, in 2003, 2004, there was a 141-day strike in the grocery industry in Southern California. That was primarily around two issues. One, the construct of healthcare coverage, and two, whether or not you would prospectively change pension accrual for new employees and create an even lower tier for new employees. That was my union. That was the strike that I coordinated for 141 days. And there was always a realization that you had to make modifications. The question were how much, how far, how fast. But in the private sector, there's this realization that things only work if they ultimately pencil out for everybody. In the public sector, because the case law is such that it says you can't change even future year accruals for current employees, the scope of change that you can make is more limited, which means the cuts that you have to make have to be deeper. Much like budgeting in California, where we've siloed a variety of different areas. So when you have an economic downturn, instead of taking little cuts everywhere, you have to take deeper and disproportionate cuts in some areas because some things are off the table. So until the courts change their determination of whether or not you can make changes in accrual for current employees prospectively, the only option is to constrain accrual rates for future employees, for new employees. In 2012, I think it is, we passed PEPRA, the Public Employee Pension Reform Act, which was the largest reform of public pensions that the state had ever done. It was a significant multi-billion-dollar savings over time. But when you look at the unmet obligations of current folks in the pension system, it didn't go deep enough. And so I think the next governor and the legislature are going to have to go back and revisit this another time and be informed by any changes that may happen in the courts. I think that there's a significant likelihood that there will be new cases filed that will allow for not retroactively decreasing, but decreasing prospectively even for current employees. And I think there's a rational argument to be made for why you'd want to do that.
We have time for one last question.
I thought we were going till 1:15.
Okay, we have time for some more questions. I'm actually not
Otherwise,
sure.
I would have cut the speech shorter, sorry.
Here we go.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your talk. You mentioned having to work with both aisles in order to pass balanced budget because of the supermajority limit. And given that now we have a Democratic supermajority, I'm wondering what do you think that means for the legislature moving forward in passing balanced budgets?
Couple of things. One, I won the supermajority. I was the first speaker in 140 years to have a bicameral supermajority. The last one was Hugh LaRue, 140 years before me. Now, before I got the supermajority in 2012, I was the only Democratic legislative leader in the country to grow my majority in 2010, the only one in the country. And so when we grew the majority in 2010, at that same time, it was clear that the voters had also approved simple majority budgeting. And so people were worried that now we wouldn't be consultative with the minority party. So here I was, a speaker who grew my majority and no longer needed Republican votes for a budget. What did I do? I appointed Republicans as committee chairs, which hadn't been done in a long time. Because I wanted to demonstrate that even though we didn't need Republican votes to pass a budget, that it didn't change our obligation to be truly consultative in how we did our business, right? So 90% of what the legislature does is done on a simple majority basis. It's just that other 10%. But when you take away something like the budget from that 10%, people feel marginalized. And so it was important to appoint a couple of Republican committee chairs as a clear demonstration of the fact that we didn't want to walk away from opportunities for bipartisan agreement where it could be achieved. Now, let's be very frank. I had to make them committee chairs of committees that didn't traditionally make decisions on overly partisan grounds, right? So I wasn't going to make the Republicans the chair of the Labor Committee or the Environmental Quality and Toxics Committee. But there are a variety of committees that don't make decisions on overly partisan lines. So I had to put Republican chairs in committees like that to demonstrate an ability to continue to try to work on a bipartisan basis where it could be done. People look at California and how progressive the legislature is and the supermajorities that have come back and fail to appreciate that in any given year between 70 and 80% of all legislation passed in the state of California is passed with a bipartisan vote. If you look at press coverage, you would think that maybe 5% of legislation is passed on a bipartisan vote. Why? Because when you're passing stuff on a bipartisan vote, it tends to be less exciting to watch because there aren't as many fights. And it's less worthy of press consideration. But even as we gained even as we no longer needed Republican votes for a budget, and even as we gained the supermajority, I kept, even after I got to the supermajority, I kept appointing Republicans as committee chairs in a couple of committees to try to keep that process going.
Wonder if you could speak to the state of higher education in California and the challenges that we face in the next 5 years.
Look, we're in a dangerous place. There are a couple of challenges that we face, nationally and here in California. There are some who view higher education as a net negative. 2 weeks ago yesterday, we were at Yale for a discussion with presidents of significant universities and governing board members of significant universities. And it was an interesting national cross-section. I was the only Californian in the room. And as we were looking at public support for higher education, public, private, nonprofit, 56 or 59%, Tig, of Republican respondents to a poll thought that higher education was a net negative for society. Shocking number, because there's this belief that we're not doing a good enough job in true discourse, that we benefit certain thought more than other thought, that there is ideological bias in higher education. Is that something we need to concern ourselves with? Yes. Do I believe it's an accurate depiction? No. But we still have to be conscious of where it does express itself, because there are examples of where it expresses itself. So if you have a significant number of voters, even if it wasn't 59%, which it was either 56 or 59, even if it was 25% or 30%, that's something we have to be concerned about in terms of future support for higher education in general. In a variety of places, that's particularly problematic for public higher education because you're talking about investments of public funds. In a place like California, it also is impactful in private, for-profit higher education because of the investment of public financial aid. But for all of higher education, federal financial aid is at issue. And that doesn't just limit students who are beneficiaries of financial aid. it has an impact on the finance scheme of all institutions who have students that receive financial aid. The other place is in terms of federal grants and state grants for research. If a growing number of people find higher education to be problematic, the future of investment in that research is in jeopardy. When you look at some of the specific implications of the tax bill and what that means for philanthropic investment in higher education, hugely concerning. So I think we're at an incredibly precarious moment for questions of support for higher education, both as a social good and as a place for economic investment.
I think people might be slipping out,
Got
but
it.
I would love to ask the question that we were discussing at lunch, which is the way that the direct democracy reforms of Hiram Johnson, specifically the recall referendum and initiative, may have impacted governing California.
I hate all three of them. I am not a fan of direct democracy. I am a fan of representative democracy. This is not a position that I came to being in office. It's a position I've had for a long time. I think the progressive era reforms were well-intentioned, and they were born out of a frustration of the disproportionate power of a limited number of people, not the least of which the railroad industry, which was the target of all three of those reforms, the referendum, the recall, and the initiative process. When you look at all of them, it was to create a popular safety net or escape valve when well-held special interest wielded too much power in the election and legislative decisions of folks in public office. If you look at the last last century, second half of the last century, you'll see that it's kind of been inverted, that only well-held interests can avail themselves of any of those three tools. Anybody here tell me when the last time a ballot measure or a referendum was popularly passed without huge investment from a well-held interest? When was the last time there was actually a grassroots referendum or ballot measure in California? Anybody? That's because it was before the lifetime of any student in this room. It was 1988. So 1988, insurance reform called Voter Revolt, which was a good title to get people's attention, was the last time there was a grassroots qualification of a ballot measure in California. It now takes multiple millions of dollars just to qualify a question and tens of millions of dollars to successfully pass a measure. Same is true for the recall process. It takes well-held interest groups to fund the signature gathering to successfully recall somebody. And the other thing is, because a initiative that's popularly passed can't be amended by the legislature, we're often dealing with the unintended consequences of initiatives and frustration when people try to figure out, well, why couldn't you fix that small problem that came up in this super simplistic idea? Why do I say super simplistic? When you're working on legislation, you get to get into nuance. We don't do it often enough, but you get to get into nuance. When you're dealing with a ballot initiative, you have to figure out 2 or 3 sentences that are resonant, and you want to get away from complexity and nuance, because the way you lose a ballot measure fight is if you have too much complexity and nuance. So not only is it only a tool available to well-heeled groups, it requires them to dumb down that idea to the simplest explanation, and simplest explanations are rarely the best solutions for the problems that we face. One last question, I guess, or 2.
Okay. So I really appreciated the part of your talk where you were speaking about ensuring those 8 subsequent budgets coming in on time. increased California's credit rating and brought down the cost of financing. I was wondering if you could speak to both California's demand for financing at the state and local level and its pricing of financing moving forward, especially given the Republican tax plan's elimination of SALT deductions.
I don't know. I don't know that I fully understand all the implications because we're still trying to unravel a variety of them, and the state is looking at a couple of workarounds that I, quite frankly, don't hold out a lot of hope for. We made very meaningful reforms that didn't fundamentally shift the finance system, okay? So we made meaningful reforms of a pre-existing structure. What we didn't do is come up with a new structure. And what happened at the federal level may require us to go back and look at a whole new structure. California is disproportionately dependent on individual income tax as the way of generating revenue for the state, and disproportionately dependent on the revenue from well-heeled individuals. It's why our cycles are wilder than other states. And so when we did simple majority, we didn't change that. Even when we did the rainy day fund, we didn't change that. What we did is we looked at the predictability of revenues and said when they spike, you put them aside. I think this is really a moment where, as we evaluate the implications of the federal tax plan, we ask whether we restructure the whole finance system for the state. When you do that, you have to look at the finance system for local government as well. So while the state is disproportionately dependent on income tax, local government is disproportionately dependent on transit occupancy tax and retail sales tax. Neither of these systems is a rational system that you would design if you were going to look at a finance system that diversified the state's revenue and looked at giving state and local government the best tools for economic development. So one of the other pieces of legislation that took me a couple of years to pass was the creation of GoBiz, the Governor's Office of Business Development. Arnold vetoed it because I put in there Senate confirmation for the executive officer. He didn't want Senate confirmation, so he vetoed it. I convinced Jerry to sign it when I rewrote it without the Senate confirmation. It was a tool, but only one tool. California hasn't used it as aggressively as I think we need to. In 2013 or 2014, I proposed creating an economic development arm above and beyond GoBiz under AB 53. We couldn't ultimately get it passed that year. I think the state has to go back and look at not only financing models, but economic development models that will help us transition into the reality of life under the new federal construct. And then I think you've got the last question.
Hi, I was wondering what you thought about how to address some of the flaws from state level implementation of healthcare legislation, especially for rural resource states like Alaska, Montana, and the Dakotas, which are a lot more susceptible to budgetary changes and revenue changes.
I will tell you that I have not. I looked at the reality of rural and underserved sections of California, and it informed how we structured Cover to California, because I thought a one-size-fits-all federal exchange wouldn't deal well with the complexity of the sub-regions of the state. And so we took a lot of time teasing out what those models would be in California. I'm not arrogant enough to think that you could just take that and overlay it in another state, because even most of the parts of California that we think of rural are more densely populated than rural areas of other states. I would say that one of the key models that you have to look at is what the delivery system is, what the prevalence is of federally qualified health care providers in a given area. In many of those states, what the infrastructure is for Indian health care, which are huge providers in key rural parts of the state as well. The other thing that I think you have to look at is better use of technology. And because you're never going to get the density of specialists in outlying areas that you'd like to have. And so we have an interesting opportunity to integrate telemedicine into those approaches. So if you can get the right density of primary care physicians and both a technological and contract relationship with specialists from other areas to provide evaluation and some treatment by telemedicine, I think that's a key component. One of the things, for example, in California that's different than other states is the need to deal with language delivery, healthcare delivery that's both culturally competent and able to be provided in appropriate sets of languages. I wrote a piece of legislation that I think I lost 3 times, and finally one of my successors passed after I left office, creating a translation infrastructure for healthcare delivery. The first challenge I had was convincing folks that I'm not talking about Spanish. And the reason I say that is, in most areas of the state, there's somebody in an emergency room that speaks Spanish. And so that's actually the place where we have the least significant gap. There's a gap, but it's the least significant. But when you're looking at Hmong, when you're looking at Urdu, when you're looking at Russian in different population centers of the state, and the lack of infrastructure we have for healthcare providers in those languages, it results in misdiagnosis and either undertreatment or overtreatment that is incredibly costly. And it's actually cheaper to create the translation infrastructure, some of it remotely, than it is to deal with the reality of the implications of undertreatment and overtreatment. So if I were looking at a rural model, I'd look at language access where appropriate, but I'd really look at telemedicine and the coordination of telemedicine with a pre-existing healthcare infrastructure in a given area, and how you create a reimbursement system that works for that locality. By definition, the math around the reimbursement is going to be different, especially in a hyper-rural area, than it's going to be in an urban area. And it may be significantly more expensive on a capitated basis, but that's what you have to take into account in creating that system. Thank you all very much.